What's up, y'all?
It's episode 1.
Yo, episode 1 with Taylor and Elise.
This is already going really, really bad.
Yeah. So what do you want to talk about?
All right. So we decided today we're going to talk about kind of like our introduction into worship ministry, how that went, how it could have gone better, and yeah, just kind of have a conversation about what's the thing you say? Character over competency.
Yeah, I think, when I look at our stories, we both kind of got pulled into ministry because maybe we were skilled, but maybe our character wasn't necessarily ready to carry the calling that we were either pursuing or being kind of like pulled into. So I think it'll be kind of fun to just talk about, our experience and just some of the underlying issues for people going into ministry, but also I think there are also underlying issues within like just church leadership and how we are recruiting people for our ministry teams, staff, pastors. And so, it'll be fun conversation.
Yeah. So I'll start. My story with how I got called or onboarded into like worship ministry at church is pretty simple. It's basically because I was like, I'm a good singer and I want people to know I'm a good singer. So I might as well get up on a stage at church and sing. I didn't really know what worship was. I was like, okay, a worship leader is just someone who sings on a stage about God. Okay, I can do that. So I started leading worship when I was probably about 16 or so, and it was at the church youth group where we actually met. So he was already on. Oh, you know what? I don't even know if you know this. You were on the worship team before me. Obviously, you play guitar.
Yeah, I was.
And I was like, wow, that boy is so cute.
Look at those skinny jeans.
So honestly, you were part of the motivation. I mean, when it comes to teenage girls or middle school girls, one of the driving motivations for doing anything is like because there's cute boys there,
Obviously. I've only gotten cuter and skinnier.
So anyways, like my audition consisted of going into an office back room kind of thing with the person who was leading or directing the youth worship team, they're awesome. Like they're awesome people and still we're friends with them today. But my audition was go in there and sing. I sang a couple songs and, I was like, oh, you're good. And the other thing is too, like, people did know me. People knew my mom and my family and stuff and knew that I was raised Christian. And I wasn't like this person who's like out, smoking pot and drinking. And I didn't do any of that stuff. So I feel like they're like, okay, this girl lives a good Christian life and, has a good voice. So why not? Why not?
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think the bar just gets set super low, especially when I think about like youth ministry contexts where you're trying, maybe the youth pastor or whoever, they're trying to pull a youth band together and you may not have a lot to work with. And so you're kind of just maybe willing to just let anyone who has some skill to just jump in. And I think there's like the heart towards that is not bad. Like you want to get people plugged in. You want them to serve. You want them to feel like they're a part of something. But I also feel like there's like a negative side to that too, because like just what you're communicating to that person as you're bringing them into like an upfront role on a stage, you're almost in a way communicating to them without saying it that I care more about your gifting than your heart, especially if you're not getting to know them before.
I agree with that. And that's even something that has carried with me, at least, like even till now. It's like, it's really prevalent, I think, in churches. And I don't think it's intentional at all churches. I think it's a culture thing too within Western Western churches and what they've kind of become. But I'm always like, okay, now does this person want me to be a part of this event or be a part of this gathering because they actually value who I am and like the spiritual gifts that I have and how I can help build up the body and all that stuff? Or do they just want Taylor to bring his guitar and us sing together? You know, and I think I overthink that way too much, but it all started there for me at youth group.
Yeah. And in a sense, it can be like the church, you know, at the end of the day, if you're not really like knowing these people and loving them and understanding how God has wired them, and you're just throwing them into a ministry, you're not caring for their heart. And in a sense, you're kind of like using them because they're gifted to make your church look good or to make your ministry look good. And I think that's a temptation for just people who are ministry leaders, is you want your ministry to look successful. You want people to show up. And so I think there's this temptation that because we have to have we have to execute something well and at a certain level, you know, production in order to maybe draw people in, we're willing to sacrifice certain things on the altar of building a successful ministry, when at the end of the day you're building something. You're building with the wood, hay, and stubble, you know, like Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, instead of the gold, silver, and precious stones, like, which is like the presence of God. And like, and we don't want to build our ministries in a way that does not have like integrity and focus on character of our people.
And we don't want to build our ministries with earthly materials. Like, we want to build them with heavenly, eternal materials, like you were saying, like the presence of God. And I mean, the most successful ministries or things that I've ever been a part of have been like, they're not to the world, you know, on a worldly standard, it could look not successful. Like, wow, there's like 30 people in this church gathering, or, you know, they don't even have like a fog machine, you know, or whatever. Like, that was a joke. It's not very funny, but well,
the fog machine brings the spirit, right?
The pillars.
That's how you know the presence is.
No, but like when you have people who are, I know the word like anointed can mean different things to different groups of people, but when you have people who God is specifically set apart for a purpose and ministry and role, and you have them in like the right roles, that's what's going to make something successful. And I mean, like, I was talking about my story, and the first thing you need to make sure if you're calling somebody into a ministry, especially like an upfront on the platform ministry, but all in general, you know, is like, not do they know about Jesus, not do they know what the Bible says you should and shouldn't do, or not do you know, have scriptures memorized, but like, have you met Jesus? Because meeting Jesus literally changes everything, and that's what qualifies you, is the relationship with him and like the spirit in you.
Yeah. And I think it's like, obviously we don't know, like, we can't look at someone and say you are saved or you're not saved. But I think that's why it's so important to get to know a person, to just know who they are, what their heart is like. Like if we look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, where it talks about even like qualifications for deacons, which are like servants in the church. It says, deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain, and they must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. So it's like, do the people you're bringing onto your team, like, hold the mystery of the faith, the gospel of Jesus Christ, like, with a clear conscience? Like, is that their foundation? And then also it says in verse 10, and let them also be tested first, then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. And so I think when we're bringing people into like upfront ministry roles or even like staff or whatever, it's like there should be a testing period before we're like really inducting someone into like a period of time to get to know the person, to spend time with them outside of church settings too, and getting to know people who even are close to them. Like, and I think it maybe depends on like the level of role we're talking about, right? Like if we're talking about like your hospitality team, maybe that looks a little different than if like you're hiring a worship pastor. You're obviously like gonna invest more into that process, but regardless, like we should know the character of the people that we are having, especially in upfront ministry roles, because ultimately they're up there representing your church. They're representing the body of Christ. And then, people who know them outside of church might see something totally different than what they're like in church. And so that's where just character matters, much more than competency.
And I think it's hard because, we're talking about youth group and we were kids. So
Yeah.
that's like a whole
It is different
ball game. We could probably talk about youth ministry, kids ministry, and we probably will eventually. But I think the reason we're talking about like where we started and like the things, sorry, I'm kind of like fumbling over this right now, but the things that I experienced as a worship leader in youth group, I mean, I experienced them when I'm in my mid-20s as well. So it's just similar across. It wasn't just a youth group thing. So I want to make that clear. We're not like or whatever.
Yeah, I think it starts there, but it's easy for that kind of culture to just seep in anywhere,
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's similar for me. So like for me getting into ministry was basically, long story short, I grew up within the church and just got into music really young, did piano and drums and guitar. And by the time I hit middle school, that was like when I could get into the youth band at church, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so for me, I was really excited to get up on stage in front of all those pretty middle school girls and with my skinny jeans and my long hair and look like a rock star. and I think there was some mixture to the motivations. It wasn't purely just for that, but that's always something like, even today, even as like an adult and someone who's grown so much, like those things don't completely go away. It's like you still have to check your motivation every time you get up to lead anywhere, and ask the Lord to just like search your heart. But for me, it was like I wanted to serve the Lord, but I also really loved the praise of man, and I loved doing that kind of thing. And so that kind of progressed through, went from like doing music on worship teams to like leading worship and singing more. And then we met when I was a freshman and we started hanging out, but we were also on the worship team. So we kind of met through the worship team and then started dating. And I started hanging out with your friends. And when I was 16, so a sophomore in high school, I pursued this job at the daughter church of the church that I grew up at, which is the one we were serving together at. And I applied for this music director position as a 16-year-old kid. And I remember filling out the application and there were like questions about character and different things like that. And I remember lying about some of those things. Like there were certain things that I hid and lied about because getting this job or having a shot at this was like more important to me than just like than having integrity, and doing it.
Was it like character things that you lied about?
Yeah, it was like questions. I don't remember the specific questions. I just remember knowing that I wasn't being like totally truthful about like where my heart was at with certain things, like because there was definitely some like impurity that I was living in. Like our relationship, we were dating at the time, our relationship was not pure, and so, but I was not willing to expose those things because I cared too much about what people thought about me to be willing to expose, what was really going on. So anyways, long story short, I ended up basically kind of lying my way into that role. And, looking back on it, like, I think, the Lord did a lot, but like, I just so regret the way that I got into that. It just started it was the kickoff of just like a web of lies that carried on for a long time into, like our marriage and ministry positions that I was in along the road at a number of different churches. Not saying like all of it was bad, like the Lord was working in all of it, and God is so good at like redeeming things. Even if we weren't walking God's will, he'll still take it. Like, he doesn't waste it. Mm-hmm. But I think that doesn't mean there wasn't a better way. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah. All right.
Sorry, one of our kids, I was like hearing footsteps as Taylor was talking, and I'm like, man, it's like, what time is it right now? It's almost midnight.
It's almost midnight.
And our kid was awake. So I'm like,
we're still talking.
Yeah, we're still talking.
So yeah, I can't remember exactly what we're talking about, but
we're talking about like your story.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So I kind of lied my way into ministry. And from there on, really kind of kicked off this journey of pursuing ministry. Pursuing like my dream was to be, worship leader, worship pastor of a big church. Wanted to have an awesome worship band where we're writing songs and people know who we are, and I think it's just so interesting, like, because you think about like what a worship leader's job is to do, and it's like really the job is to just like give honor and glory to God and point people to the Lord. But for many of us, like in our journey leading worship, there is this motivation actually to like want glory from people.
Yeah.
So I don't know, what's your experience been like with that, and like how have you been able to fight against that?
Well, first of all, I think looking back on my motives, it was really easy for me to justify them somehow, or to convince myself that no, I'm actually humble. But like, I would pray, God, it'd be like really cool if we could be a part of a big church someday, because that we're good, God, and we could reach so many people for you, like for the gospel, and we'd remain humble, God, like it's okay, or like God would want this, and I'd kind of like justify my motives. But deep down, like I knew that I was being really selfish and looking for the glory, which is so incredibly dangerous. Okay, but God is so gracious to humble us. But I just wanted to read real quick when you were talking about what is the job of worship leader. I remember, this is just a little anecdotal story, but I remember when I was in college and I wanted to serve on InterVarsity, which is a ministry it's kind of like crew, but a little different. Anyways, and my reason was because I would hear them. I didn't even go, but I would hear them when I walked into the like university center, big building. And I'm like, man, their worship team sounds really good. I want to do that. And so I met with the person and she asked a question and she said, "What is worship?" And I was like, well, it's singing and praising God. And that's what I thought worship was. But she's like, no, actually, this is what it is. And I'm in 1 Corinthians on my app right now, but Romans 12 starts out by saying, "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Don't be conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewal of your mind." And then it goes on, and looking back, I was not any of those things. I wasn't leading worship from a place of like, wow, God has been so merciful to me. God is so worthy and amazing. I believed those things, but it wasn't where my worship flowed from, you know?
Yeah.
I didn't answer your question, but that's kind of what was in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think there's a whole bunch of different things to talk about with that, but I think the most important thing is like, because you can be up on a stage leading people in worship and you can look like you're really close to God, but in reality be really far from the Lord. I think about in John where Jesus addresses the Pharisees and says, this people worships me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And I think a lot of my journey has been like that. But what I've learned is just the importance of abiding in Jesus and being close to Jesus and cultivating a personal intimacy and a relationship with the Lord. Because ultimately, if you don't have that intimacy and fellowship and that abiding relationship where you are abiding in the vine, you're not going to bear fruit. For so much of my journey, I was operating out of my own gifting and charisma. I was operating in the flesh. I was ministering in the flesh. It was not so much an overflow of my love for the Lord. And I'm not saying for my entire ministry, but for certain parts of it, especially, I was operating out of my own abilities, and it wasn't a spillover of just me spending time in the presence of God, loving him. And I think like that scripture you brought up, like, is my life a living sacrifice outside of Sunday morning worship? Like, what does my life look like? And I can say honestly, like, for so much of my ministry, there was not a lot of that living sacrifice happening anywhere outside of the stage, you know? And so, yeah, it's a big issue, but it's one that unless the people around you really know you personally, like, people aren't going to know that, right? Unless they like see you outside of ministry and they see you sinning or whatever it is, right? Like, it's easy to hide, and it's easy, I think another temptation in ministry is to keep distance from people so they don't really know who you are. You know,
put on your best face, especially when you're in upfront ministry. There's that temptation to conceal what you feel like you can just kind of deal with on your own. Nobody needs to know. It's going to get solved eventually. Like, it's okay. It would be worse for them if they knew. Whatever. You can spin it anyway.
Yeah.
And then there's also, I don't know, did you want to talk more about that?
No.
I'm also thinking of, I've always been a really honest with who I am and what's going on type of person for the most part. So, I don't know, just as you're talking about concealing things from people, like they wouldn't really know you, I feel like there was a period of time where I was like close with a lot of people who I actually did go to church with, but those were people that I would like drink too much with sometimes, or have like crude jokes with, or bad language and whatever, just not live in a way that was God honoring, but they were church friends. So, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah. And that's like a whole nother conversation, right? It's just about like purity in the church, right? And like what's being tolerated, even in leadership, certain thing like sinful behaviors that churches will just kind of tolerate or brush under the rug or just like be okay with, and I think, the Lord's really just developed our purity, and like he just continues to like convict us of things and just remove certain things from our lives that like 10 years ago we would have thought was like totally okay to do this and that, whereas like now it's like the Lord is just taking us to another like level, not to like puff ourselves up, but he just continues to purify you as you walk with him.
And that's what he does because he's so good. And there's things that we would be okay with in our lives. Yeah, like you said, 10 years ago, that it was like we wouldn't be sinning by doing certain things, but he's calling us to just different, like, higher degrees of holiness. He's like, okay, now I'm asking you to do this, not because what it's against, I don't know how to word this, not because it is just innately sinful to do this as a Christian, but because I'm asking you to die more. I'm asking you to lay more of your life down for me, because he wants us to be holy as he's holy, and it's out of his goodness and his grace, and whatever he calls us to do, he equips us to do. You know, he gives us that strength to do it, and he blesses it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, and I think so kind of continuing on our story, like we kind of bounced around to different ministry situations. So like we moved out to Milwaukee to help plant a church. Then we ended up moving back to the Richmond, Wisconsin area, kind of going back to the church we were at for a few years. Then I bounced over to like a full-time ministry position doing like worship and youth ministry. Did that for a couple years. And then, you know, the real dream was like full-time worship pastor, right? So then we moved down to Florida, where I got a full-time worship pastor job at a really awesome church down there. And that was the dream. And I think just one of the biggest issues that I've had to deal with in my heart was ministry being the dream. Like the goal was like reach this level of like ministry. Like I wanted to have a successful ministry, and that mattered, and I pursued that at the expense of like me walking in dignity, and at the expense of like my marriage in some ways too. And that was something that had to die. Like the Lord had to kill that. And ultimately, you know, many of you know who know us, like we ended up moving from Florida back up to our hometown, and the Lord's kind of actually pulled us out of like vocational ministry for a season. But it's actually been like probably the most impactful season of ministry for us since we actually got out of vocational ministry. Not saying vocational ministry is bad, but for me personally, like just the ministry idol had to die. Ministry was an idol for me. And rather than just like knowing and pursuing just the fullness of what Jesus had for me, even if it meant dying to self, I pursued that. But then the Lord kind of brought me to a point where I just had a moment of deep conviction one night where I just like repented. And I felt such a deep conviction where I ended up just needing to confess some things to my wife, confess some things to my pastors. And ultimately, the Lord just made it clear, like, hey, it's time for a break. You've been doing this for over 10 years and not with full integrity and honesty. And it's time to take a season, like, away from ministry because the most important thing is knowing and loving Jesus. Like, that is the most important aspect of the Christian life, is to know Jesus, to know him.
And I think that's the thing that changed, and why these last couple of years have been so impactful and so fruitful, is because like the dream changed. Forever the dream was ministry, and now the dream is just Jesus. He's the dream. And just the amount of peace and like fruitfulness that comes from just like being like, all right, you know what, God, like not my will, but yours be done. It's so much easier, so much better. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes, I mean, it's not easier. It's not.
It is and it isn't.
It is and it isn't. It's like, I mean, there's a lot of, I feel like, testing, not in like all these trials and tribulations right now, but just testing us, like God's almost like, hey, you're my friend and I want to test your friendship. Like, how far are you willing to go for me? How much are you willing to lay down for me? But the more we lay down, even though it's like, oh, I really don't want to do this, and like my flesh doesn't want to do this, the more we're like, whatever, but you're worth it, and I trust you. Just the more life springs out of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree. Like we're called to, like the scriptures say, I think it's 2 Corinthians 4, where it's like God just transforms us from, as we behold Jesus, the Spirit of God transforms us from one glory to the next.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sanctification, like we were saved, we're being saved, and we will be saved. God is just constantly like just saving us from ourselves in just different ways, and just renewing us and transforming us to the likeness of Jesus. And it's a continual thing, right? But yeah, I think that was the biggest revelation for us, was when the dream became Jesus. Like just the burden kind of is lifted.
Mm-hmm.
Like when we're not pursuing a ministry, but we're just pursuing a person. I don't know. I don't even know how to get the words out that I'm trying to say right now. But when he becomes more important than anything else, like everything falls into place. It's like, seek first the kingdom of God, then all will be added. When I was kind of seeking first my kingdom, and not a lot of good was happening. I mean, good stuff happened, right? Like,
well, God uses
God
it.
used all of it. Like there were so many times throughout that whole period of time where God like just worked in a lot of amazing ways.
Mm-hmm.
And like throughout all of that, like we were learning and we were growing, but until we realized just the importance of pursuing Jesus above anything else, like that was just like the turning point. And there's so much to unpack with that. I feel like that's another episode to just talk about, like, what does it mean to do ministry in just full dependence on Jesus, and to like take the weight off of your shoulders.
Well, because our systems and our ideas, our ministries, our kingdoms, like those are going to fail. So there's a lot more pressure with building your own stuff, building your own campaigns, doing whatever. But like, if you're fully relying on Jesus to show up in your church services, to show up in worship, and that's it. Like, it's not on how good you sing. It's not on how tight the band is. Excellence is good unto the Lord. Like, we should be pursuing those things, but we shouldn't be relying on them to have a good church service or a successful church service, because all you need is Jesus to be there. And it's a success, and he's not going to fail.
Yeah. And I think like the revelation really was like, Jesus is in the room. Like when we gather, like I'm talking about like worship gatherings, right? Like when we started to worship as if Jesus was standing there right in front of us, because he is, like, maybe not physically, but spiritually. When the church gathers, when two or more are gathered, he is present. He is enthroned on the praises of his people. And so, like, just to know, like, okay, Jesus is in the room. Okay, Jesus, what do you want to do with this time? Holy Spirit, like, what are you leading us to do right now? And obviously it's like we have our plans, right? But it's like, man, sometimes the Lord wants to do something else, and it would just be way better that way. And I think I want to do like an episode just focusing on that, like doing ministry with Jesus instead of by yourself in your flesh, because it's easier kind of to do it in your flesh because you can have your plan and you execute your plan, right? But when you're doing it with Jesus, it feels riskier because you don't really know what might happen in a particular ministry setting. But when you put yourself in that place of dependence, he shows up in that weakness. Like, he loves when we humble ourselves enough to rely on him. And man, it's like whenever we do, we just rely and say, Lord, what do you want to do? Lord, what are you trying to say right now? Like, he shows up And then what's even greater about it is that he gets more glory.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't something that we did in the flesh. It was like, oh, we needed God right then and there. And he came. He moved. He healed. He saved. He gave a word, a prophecy, or whatever. Like, it's just so amazing when the power of God shows up. And I think Jesus is so eager and ready to just show up and move. But for many of us in our churches, we're ignoring the fact that he is there and ready to do it, or we're just oblivious to that.
Well, or you might say, like, oh, well, if he's there, he can just do it if he wants to.
Yeah.
Like, isn't he God? Doesn't he have all this power to do it?
Yeah.
The thing is, yeah, he can and he does, but what does Jesus want? He wants to be our friend, and not just our friend. He wants to be our best friend. And how merciful and good and gracious that he wants to do his ministry through us and with us. He wants co-laborers.
Yeah.
Thank you. Because that's just his character.
He's not going to force himself,
No, and he has.
something.
I've heard of church services.
And he will
where it's
sometimes,
like,
but like he's looking for us to have that dependence on him and that reliance on him. And he wants to co-labor with us.
And he wants our faith. Like, it's almost when you are in a church service and you're like, hey, God, like, I'm just relying on you. Like, that's faith. And faith is so precious to the Lord. One of our old neighbors said faith is the currency of heaven. And I just love that. And it's true. And when you're fully just putting that trust in God to show up and do it, it's such a precious act of worship and sacrifice. Like, you're sacrificing your own things, because sometimes we're like, man, this would be really good. This idea would be good and great. And God can give those when you're planning for a service or planning a worship set. He can totally move in that way in the preparation. But we should always be listening, if we truly believe he is there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we'll do an episode just on this, but I think like one of the most important scriptures to me, just in this whole idea of like ministering in dependence on the power of God and not in our own flesh and wisdom, is 1 Corinthians 2, when Paul says, "And I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom." So with like excellent speech and in a fleshly way of drawing people in because it's performed well. But I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's so important that when we're ministering, when we're proclaiming the gospel to people, when we're singing the gospel over people, that we're doing this in such a way that that it's independence on the power of God and not the wisdom and the abilities and the talent of men. We're not depending on the talent. We're depending on God is in our midst and he wants to move. And so, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe a good place to close for episode 1. There's just a lot more conversations to have out of that.
Go on that's for like hours.
I think that, kind of hits at the core of like the season of ministry that the Lord has led us into. Mm-hmm. He's taken us out of just various ministry situations where we just for a long time relied on our own abilities and skills, and has taken us into a season of abiding and depending on his power. And when we abide in him, it says in John 15 that we will bear much fruit. Mm-hmm. And so that's our encouragement we want to leave you with today, is just abide in Jesus. Don't focus on what you can do. Abide in him and see what he does through you, just through you making your home in the love of Jesus and just being with him in prayer and in his word. And he wants to use you. He wants to minister through you, but he wants to do it with you, and he wants you to be dependent on him. And so, yeah. Any closing thoughts for you?
Nope.
All right. We've talked long enough. Blessings, y'all. We'll see you in the next episode.